Welcome to Big Blend Radio's English Connection podcast. I'm the producer, Lisa Smith.
And I'm your host, Glynn Burrows.
Well, hi, everybody. We are talking about pirates on today's English Connection show on Big Blend Radio with Glynn Burrows. You can go to his website, englishconnection.uk, to learn more about Glynn and his Norfolk Tours service that he has in England. He takes people around, helps you find your family history, or will take you around to see the different things that you want to experience in England. And maybe it's a little bit of pirate history. And I think this is exciting. Glynn, it is International Pirate Month in a few days. I know we're airing this at the end of July, but August is International Pirate Month. And then September 19th is International Talk Like a Pirate Day.
Wow.
I know. What is it about like this fascination of pirates? And there's like a little romance kind of vibe with them. We all like the villains, don't we?
I think we like naughty boys. And, how many of us were brought up with pirates they were not nice looking people. They didn't look very clean. They didn't speak very nice, but we all loved them anyway. It's only recently that we've seen pirates like, I don't know what the bloke's name is, but Jack
Sparrow. Yeah.
And my wife likes Jack Sparrow because he's quite a handsome chap. But most pirates from when I was a kid were not nice people, but we loved them anyway. And it's really strange.
And now we have Johnny Depp and we have Keith Richards as the oldest pirate.
Oh, do we? I
That's
don't know.
still living. I don't know. He's dressed like a pirate before.
Well, who knows? But I know Johnny Depp, if that's the bloke you mean, who's Jack Sparrow. I mean, he's very popular with the women, isn't he? Or the ladies.
Well, there's also was that long drawn out lawsuit trial between him and his ex. Yeah, that was everybody was glued to that. It was the most interesting trial ever, where she accused him of all kinds of things, and he went back at her, and it was really fascinating. And I will not go into details on this podcast because we do try to keep it clean, even though we're talking about pirates. So anyway, I will tell you something really funny after this. And everyone, just if you don't remember that trial, Google it and you'll see there are very funny things involving bedside behavior.
Pirates. Anyway, the pirates generally had a long beard. They generally wore one of those tricorn hats. So it's a hat with three points. They often smoked a broken clay pipe, which was pretty normal in them days. They normally wear a 3/4 length dress coat.
So they like things in threes.
Yeah, it seems as though they did, didn't they? Yeah, 3/4. They normally wore a waistcoat and breeches with the trousers that fitted into the boots, the tops of the boots. And they always had a flintlock pistol tucked in their waistband of their trousers. So they were pretty rough looking. Like I said, a lot of them even had a wooden leg, didn't they? Peg leg Jake or whatever, So they were not the nicest of people to meet. But I forgot the parrot. Yeah, they also had a parrot, didn't they, very often? But, that it just seems that they've got something that we all conjure up in our heads, and we just love pirate stories.
Yeah, because I think they were kind of the daredevils of the sea.
Yeah, I think they were a bit sort of like we imagine the Robin Hoods, steal from the rich and give to the poor. I think they stole from the rich and kept it all for themselves. But
well, I think there were some that helped. And I mean, if it wasn't for Jean Lafitte, New Orleans wouldn't be New Orleans in Louisiana. So Jean Lafitte, it was a good pirate with some naughty side.
So, I mean, they obviously plundered these ships. But then again, when we look into the history of piracy, a lot of it was they were plundering stuff that people had plundered from the native populations. So a lot of the pirates of the Caribbean, or the Caribbean, I think you pronounce it, they were plundering the Spanish ships and the French ships who were taking the gold that the Spanish and the French had plundered from the Mexicans and the Aztecs and the whoever's in South America. So actually, they were stealing from people who had already stolen from somebody else. So, it's not all bad.
That's what I'm saying. It's that part of it, that in-between zone, that gray area that is always attractive. And then when you think about them going after the Spanish, who won the World Cup.
Yeah, well,
But I think back to, I know I always bring him up, Sir Francis Drake and his golden his
yeah,
golden hiney. Did he, because he really, they one day want to do a show on this, the wars of the Spanish versus the English because of him. Sir Francis Drake and his, I mean, we don't like him as he wasn't the nicest of people either,
no,
but he was really loyal to the Queen. And you have to think about what he did was still difficult. It's like Christopher Columbus, not the best guy. Captain
no,
Cook, not the best guy, but they did do things that we probably wouldn't want to do. It's a little bit,
yeah, yeah,
uncomfortable what they did. So, they really did, wear their heart on the sleeve, basically, in what they did, they committed to. But did Sir Francis Drake ever? That's when he would have had pirates go after him, as if he was sailing around in a certain area versus
yeah.
the pirates coming to England. So England was pretty safe during the height of piracy, right? You've got an article, everyone, Glynn's article's linked in the episode notes, but yeah,
Yeah.
don't you think?
England was quite well protected against pirates. I mean, there were still some, because if you've got ships coming in and out of ports, you're going to have somebody who's going to jump on a ship and see if they could steal stuff. Actually, most of the piracy was done on the east coast of Americas. And was a lot of that was because that is where all the riches were coming from. Because if you think about it, a lot of stuff coming out of South America and the Mexican side of the middle part of America, and then up the east coast of America, you were then getting you were getting the gold, you were getting the silver, you were getting different crops that were really expensive in Europe. So you were
Hmm.
getting tobacco, you were getting the silks and the really expensive clothing that was being made, and all of the strange, I mean, yeah, exactly, the spices. They're the things that were really expensive, and they were the things that they were stealing because obviously they were worth a lot of money. So it wasn't just gold and silver that was worth a lot of money, because tobacco was a currency in it on its own, really. So they were stealing whatever they could. So really, for the rich pickings, where you get the biggest reward for the smallest amount of work, they were going to be people who were working on the east coast of the Americas. Whereas if you were stealing stuff from England or France or Holland, you were only going to probably get a boat full of gin or a boat full of rum or a boat full of brandy or something. So you're not going to be getting the expensive stuff like tobacco, gold, silver, silks,
Okay.
things like that.
Well, what about rum? Because that's what they always say, talk about,
Yeah,
pirates and rum because of the Caribbean and those
exactly.
areas, right? And
Because
didn't
rum
they
was,
go
yeah,
they go into all those kind of luxury items that we're talking about. And
exactly.
but then it turned into slave trade, right?
Well, the thing is, what they needed was either a triangle journey.
We're back to the three again.
Oh, we are, yeah. Three is the big number. You either had a triangle journey or a straight backwards and forwards journey. So if you were going to go from America to Europe, you would take over tobacco, stuff like that. And then on the way back again, you would bring slaves. So they needed something to bring back from Europe and Africa. So that
Okay.
that would be where the triangle would come in. So the ships would leave the east coast of the Americas with whatever they were carrying, with tobacco, gold, or whatever, go to Europe, unload all of that stuff, go down to Africa, and then go back across to the east coast of America and the Caribbean, as you say. So you've got a triangle, Europe, North Africa, the Caribbean, and then
Uh,
they go back again, fully laden with tobacco, gold, whatever else. So that's where the rich pickings were going to be. They were going to be of ships that had just left the east coast of America, heading for Europe with the gold. I mean,
mm,
it would be no good them attacking a ship that was coming from Africa to America, because it would just be full of slaves, and slaves weren't
okay.
that expensive. So what they want to do is, when they've reloaded with gold and tobacco, then you get the ship. They did used to sometimes take a slave ship, but that was mainly to get more men to fight as
Oh,
pirates. Because the
oh,
pirates needed new crews, so you might as well, if you've got a ship full of men who could turn their hand to anything, then
yeah.
you'll steal the ship laden with slaves.
And we've heard of that, of mutiny on board with, someone that's brought on maybe an orphan that they took in and then really learned the ways and took out the leader. Or they've taken slaves on board and the slaves go, let's take this over ourselves.
Well, it makes sense because if you think about it, the slave ships were not heavily crewed. There weren't many crews on
Mm,
board a slave ship. So if the slaves could break out of their manacles or, take over the ship, then they had a bit of a chance. But again, you've got to realize that a lot of the slaves were coming from inland Africa, so they wouldn't necessarily know how to sail a ship. So you've got to think about what expertise they would have. But, there were no doubt times when a slave ship would be taken over.
mm. Okay. So yeah, they take them over, steal their crew, depending on what's going on. But then the other ships, didn't the other ship? Well, I want to go back to the money part. Let's go back to the money part. What is this 8 of coins thing that you're talking about that I'm supposed to know about? In your article, we all know the story of. I'm like, no, we don't. I don't. I don't know what you're talking about.
Right. Yeah. Well, every time we always hear about pieces of eight.
Pieces of eight. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah,
What?
yeah. Pieces of eight is something that the parrot always says. Pieces of eight, pieces of eight. That's what you always hear in a pirate film. Well, a piece of eight was just a coin. They were generally minted in Mexico with Mexican gold or Seville, and then they would trade currency in the American colonies. So they would have their own value. So a piece of eight would have a different value depending on where you were. So in some parts of America, they would be used and they'd be worth 7 and 6pence, which is old English money, or they could be worth 6 shillings and 8pence in another part of America, or they could be worth 4 and 3pence. So they had different values, but they were generally accepted way to trade, because if you think about it, if you come to England and you've got $1, you can't use it in a shop because
Right.
we don't spend dollars. If you come to England and you have a traveller's check, or we used to have traveller's checks years
Oh
ago.
my gosh, American Express traveler's checks. Remember those?
Yeah, you could spend that anywhere because it was an accepted currency.
Right.
So what happened is that these pieces of eight were an accepted currency wherever you were. They had a value in gold, so they were a currency that anybody would accept. But they had different values wherever you were, so you had to be.
Okay, but it was still like a token, basically.
Yeah.
But
It would be a recognized coin.
okay, so I think that you should remind us all about how the parrot says pieces of eight.
Pieces of eight. Pieces of
There we
eight.
go. We like this. This is fun.
You didn't know I could be a parrot, did
No,
you?
I didn't, but this is fun. This is more fun than the pirate part. It's the parrot. So actually, my nickname is Kasuku, which means parrot in Swahili.
Okay.
This goes with me totally. I'm into the parrots, but you also talk about in your article about how ships changed, and that also changed piracy, right?
Yes.
Because military ships, things like that, so they couldn't really go against like the cannons of England.
Well, the thing is, the ships, if any of you have ever been to, I suppose, Jamestown, Williamsburg,
Hmm.
wherever, and you see how big a ship like the Mayflower was, you know that a ship was not very big at all. So, generally speaking, the sailing ships that were going against the pirates were very small. So they could be easily attacked by a couple of pirate ships, could come in, jump on board and kill the crew or whatever and take the ship over. But then when ships started to become bigger, obviously they were then better manned, there were more men, they then became better armed. And when you start getting cannon on board ships, they were less easy to attack, because if you get a cannonball in the side of your ship, you sink. That would be quite naughty. But then what really helped to stop piracy in a big way were when you got the steamships and you got the really big ships. Because a pirate couldn't afford a great big ship. They only had these little ships because they only had a little bit of money really to spend on their ships. So when we started getting much bigger ships, much better defense, and also by steam a lot quicker. So ships were going a lot faster when they had steam. So really pirates didn't stand a chance. So you didn't generally get pirates much after the 1850s. But now
Okay.
it's actually coming back. There are now pirates at sea that are
Like in Somalia and those areas.
yeah, so piracy is still a thing, but it's a lot more involved and a lot more than just sort of stealing the
Oh, they're smart. I mean, now piracy is like hacking your computer, and piracy is stealing money from your bank account through the internet and getting your passwords. I mean, piracy has taken on all kinds of forms.
yeah,
It's
but
like the
what I
mafia
was
started in one thing and moved into other things, you know?
yeah. But there is actually still piracy on the sea.
Yeah, there is. There
And a
is.
lot of that is sort of arms
Hmm.
control and things like that.
And we're
And
still doing, human trafficking as well. Like in our country, we have human trafficking,
yeah, we do. It's
wildlife trafficking. All the trafficking is another form of piracy.
yeah. So the thing has morphed into something else,
Yeah.
but still the same sort of principle where you've got criminals doing things to people who are
Mm.
who are doing legitimate business. The pirates are coming along and doing other things.
Right. And I wanted to say too that I'm going to put a link in the episode notes, everyone, for Glynn's past interview and article about going to maritime history museums and where you can see ships in England. Because, you may not see the pirates because they weren't really hanging out there, but I'm sure a lot of these ships had some run-ins with pirates at some point.
Things like the Mary Rose that I
Yes.
went, is part of that. Um, it would have been a ship in the 1500s, so it would have been one of the ships that could have been attacked by pirates if it had went into the wrong part of the ocean. But it was
Wow.
very very well protected because they had cannons coming out of every part of the ship. So a pirate would be pretty silly to attack
Mhm.
the Rose. But it gives you an idea about scale. It's really difficult to get an idea of the scale of the ships of the time. But when you see something like the Mary Rose, you really get an idea on the scale of stuff. And that's
Yeah.
what's interesting.
I think so. I think it's good to give you that perspective and really have a good understanding. The other thing, too, in your article, you talk about what happens in punishment of the pirates, and so England did punish pirates, right, at
Mm.
different times. And you don't steal their tea; they get mad.
It's not nice. If you were actually a pirate and you were caught, weren't generally a nice end. They didn't normally just smack them on the wrist and say don't do it again. Especially if you were a captain. If you were a captain, a real leader of the
Huh?
pirates, you were generally killed in not such a nice way, and your body would be exhibited in what they call a gibbet, which is basically an iron cage in the shape of a man. So if you can imagine having like four pieces of metal around my
Hmm.
head and then strips of metal all around my body. So when I'm killed, they then put me inside this metal cage and they hang me from a tree or a gate on the way into a city or a town. So everybody would know that if you do anything naughty like a pirate, then you're going to end up looking like this bloke. And it weren't nice.
No, at that time, because I remember hangings, there were public hangings back in the day, and
Oh,
and people had picnics at the public hangings. So, do
funnily
you
enough,
think people watched pirates getting put in these things?
funnily enough, I was in Norwich Castle today with
Oh,
my three granddaughters and my wife and my daughter. I went down into the dungeons and there was a gibbet down there actually because they were showing us what the dungeons were like. And they were saying that when one particular man was hanged in Norwich, they had to lay on special trains from London. This was in 1849. They had to lay on special trains from London because he was such an infamous character that his hanging was in the press in London. So all these people came up on a day trip to watch this man being hanged in Norwich. And like you say, people were having picnics. They were, selling special newspapers. There were normally songs that were written specially for the day. So people would buy the sheet music. It was entertainment. There would even be like a fairground going on at the same time, because obviously you've got all these crowds, thousands of people. So why not have a fairground going on at the same time to get some more of their money? So they come up to see the hanging, but there's also a fairground where there's rides and there's, hot dogs, not necessarily hot dogs, but you know what I mean. There'd be everything going on. It was a spectacle. But, some of these things were not very nice. You wouldn't necessarily want to take your children, but children went because it was what people did for entertainment, is to go and see somebody hanged.
Well, that's lovely. Did they go see Jack the Ripper on the way?
Well, if they'd have found him, they would have done. They never did find Jack the Ripper. It's still being looked at, and nobody's ever found out who it really was.
Just crazy, It's just even crazy to think that people do things like that,
Yes.
you know?
I don't know whether Jack the Ripper is something that you know a lot about in America, but I mean, he was not a nice person.
Every person I know that's gone to London, that's one of the first things they do is go on one of the Jack the Ripper tours.
Yeah,
That's a bucket list for many people.
yeah.
And that, and then they go see, Stratford upon Avon.
Yes,
Yes,
I was there last week, actually.
Shakespeare,
Yeah.
and Shakespeare kind of looks like Jack the Ripper. Like when you think about some of those old pictures, it's
Yeah,
just the clothing of the times.
You're only a few hundred years out.
Yeah, so it's interesting, but so this was not good to be caught. If you were a
No.
pirate, you do not get caught. You're not only going to die, but you're going to be pretty much tortured and shown everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, if you were fortunate, you might just get hanged or you might just get beheaded. If you were a captain, they would hang you until you were nearly dead. Then they would cut you down, because generally speaking, hanging used to be just suspended, so you would just suspend. There weren't the drop, because later on they introduced a drop so that you fell and you broke your neck as well as you were hanged. So that would
Well,
have.
this is lovely.
No, you've got to have the details. So to start with, they would just hang you, so you were getting slowly asphyxiated. But when you weren't quite dead, they would then take you down and they would disembowel you, which was not very pleasant. And then they
Lovely.
might cut off bits of your body. And, it wasn't nice, but it's what happened. And it was to act as a deterrent. If you're a pirate and you're caught, this is what's going to happen to you. Don't.
Yeah, but there's something to think about when we look at maritime history of pirates being part of that. They get left out of that story a little bit on the, people going out. Pirates came, they blew at them a bit, blew some cannons, but to understand where they're coming from. And so some were okay-ish, some weren't.
Well, at the end of the day, you've also got to think about, their stories as well, because how did they end up being a pirate?
Sometimes, like I said, they're orphaned kids or ran away from bad situations. Well, this is kind of where leading to next month. You're going to be, what the Dickens. We're going to be talking about Dickens, which leads to really bad conditions for kids working in mines, working, slave.
Yeah.
We're talking about the slave conditions, really, of what happened to
Work in lots of cases. I mean, there were children who were used as chimney sweeps, and when I'm talking about chimney sweeps, I'm not talking about putting a brush up a chimney.
No.
I'm talking about putting a child up a chimney with a brush, because in them days chimneys were reasonably big, so they were like that big. So you could put a 4-year-old child up a chimney with a brush, and they would sweep the soot. And that's what children were used for.
And then wonder why they got sick.
Well, a lot of them died, And some of the stories I've read about chimney sweeps, they really were not nice, And when you think that a lot of these people were brought up in them sort of conditions, they were brought up surrounded by violence, by hatred, by just not nice people.
Not a nice time.
So
Yeah.
we can't judge people from today because we don't know what they went through. So, if I look at myself, well, look, just now I've had tea with my granddaughters, and my 5-year-old granddaughter, I can't imagine putting her up a chimney to sweep
Oh
the
my
chimney.
gosh, no.
But things were different. If I had put her up a chimney to sweep it, she wouldn't be a very nice little girl, would she?
Wow, but we
No.
still have these things going because in this country, there's whole farms being run by little kids that came over the border. Everyone hoping they would get a better life, and they basically get sold into a market and they're owned. Like if you need to
Oh,
wear a
yeah.
shirt, all right, well, you're paying me for that shirt out of your pay, and
Oh,
your
yeah.
pay's nothing, and that is happening. It's really a sad thing. I mean, the world has not gotten that much better overnight and has a way to go, but we've also gotten better in a lot of ways, with child protection, child labor laws, and things like that. We've really moved forward, and I think we thank Dickens for being a catalyst of that as well.
A lot of what he did was to tell people about what the conditions were like.
Hmm.
You know, um, it's the same as Anna Sewell, who we've talked about before. She was telling people what animal conditions were like.
Yeah.
And it weren't until people like Dickens, like Anna Sewell, who actually told the public what it was like, then they realized and they thought, well, actually, we don't want to condone this. We want to stop it.
Hmm.
And today is exactly the same until we know that children are still being imported. Young girls are still being put over the border and forced into prostitution at stupid ages, or any age, for that matter. But, until we read about it, until we hear about it, we don't know it's going on. So
Exactly.
we can't do anything about it, but it is still going on.
And the other part is, even talking about pirates is to look, you might have a pirate in your family history. You may have a chimney sweeper in your family history. And so when you go to places where you can imagine and see what it was like, you
Yeah.
have understandings come pretty quickly, and, opinions based on, a few facts here and there is just when you travel and can experience it, you get a better idea. And forgiveness is also something important in the world as well, which is hard,
Exactly.
but
What do they say? Walk a mile in my shoes.
exactly,
And
exactly.
at the end of the day, as you know, I mean, doing my family history, I've found some people who I wouldn't necessarily be very proud of. But
Right.
at the end of the day, they're still my ancestors. I just have to say, okay, they had a bad life or they did wrong things.
You don't have to spend Christmas with them.
No, I know. Apart from they are still part of me.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like we have ancestors that I'm not into Thanksgiving dinner with, It's just not. Well, Glynn, thank you so much. I hope things cool down in England. I know you've had a hot year, so it melts all the ice cream extra quickly. The Mr. Whippy ice cream cones they melt a little quick. But
Yeah.
looking forward to next month and talking about Dickens and learning more about him and where people can go to experience those places and learn more in the different museums. So thanks so much, Glynn.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Speak to you later.
Everyone, EnglishConnection.uk.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us here on Big Blend Radio's English Connection podcast.
If you've got any queries about visiting England or Wales or Scotland, drop me a line and visit englishconnection.uk.
For more Big Blend Radio shows, visit bigblendmediahouse.com.